Hi everyone, I'm Susan Mulvihill and I'm in my vegetable garden because here we are heading into September, so it's time for the September garden tour. I've done this for June, July, and August because I feel it's really interesting and helpful to see the transition a garden goes through during the growing season. Now before I get started, I wanted to tell you that the last month has been extremely challenging. For one thing, we've had oppressive heat, even up to 107 degrees, and that's way too hot for this girl. But the other thing is we have had such smoky conditions due to the wildfires in this region. And so the conditions have been hazardous, which means I can't even go outside and work in the garden. So that was really frustrating. But beyond that, in the last few days, we have had a bit of a cool down. We can see blue skies again, and we even got a little bit of rain. So it is much more pleasant outside. So now come on into the garden and see how things are going. In the first row, I have prepared the soil in the first two beds because that's where I'm going to grow the winter garden this year. We will be moving our hoop house in a couple of weeks to cover those two beds, and in those beds I'm going to grow kale, corn salad or mosh, claytonia, which is miner's lettuce, and spinach. So indoors I have started the lettuce, spinach, and kale, and then I will direct sow the other crops into the beds shortly. In the next bed, we still have a few Walla Walla sweets left over, and they're just slowly growing, so we're leaving them and mostly using them as scallions. And then right next door is the potato bed. Now you can see that the foliage is starting to die down, and that's okay. This time of year, that's what it's going to do. And so I'm going to let it get completely frosted before I even think about harvesting the potatoes. This is one of my mixed plantings, and on the far right you can see my Chef's Choice Orange grafted tomato. Now I have to tell you, even though grafted tomatoes are supposed to be more productive, it has produced about the same amount of tomatoes as my non-grafted Chef's Choice Orange tomato. So it really hasn't made that big of a difference. Now to the left you can see that I have a lovely mix of zinnias and sunflowers that are starting to bloom. Now I had the most amazing experience last night when I was out here. I was standing right next to a zinnia, and all of a sudden this hummingbird came and it started sipping nectar right next to me in that little crown of yellow flowers that are at the top of a zinnia blossom. It was very cool. So it's really important to add flowers to your vegetable garden, both to attract pollinators and to have cool experiences like having a hummingbird right next to you. You've seen this covered bed many times before, and once again it is needing to be picked. So this is our Swiss chard and beet bed, and I keep it covered with floating row cover because I'm trying to keep the adult leaf miner fly from laying eggs on the leaves, because that will ruin a stand of Swiss chard and beets before you can say yeek. So those need to be picked again, and I'm just going to leave them covered for now. But that's on the agenda for later today. And right next door is the carrot and parsnip bed. Everything is growing beautifully, and there's really nothing new to report with them. So here's the hoop house, and if you've seen my videos before, you know that's where we're growing hot peppers and sweet peppers. All of the plants are doing great. I've been really happy with how they have done in this hoop house. They seem to really love that extra heat. We have harvested about a third of them, mostly for making salsa, and they are just doing well. We're going to keep harvesting them and enjoying them. I'm also hoping to take some to the food bank later today because we definitely have more than we need. This used to be the broccoli bed, and as you can see, the plants are completely finished and cut down. Now I'm going to leave those little stumps in the soil because I try to follow the no-till method where you disturb the soil as little as possible. So I think I'm just going to let them decompose over the winter, and they'll add some nutrients to the soil for next year's planting. Now right next door is my summer squash bed, and I'm growing both Clarimore summer squash, which is fabulous, and also trombone zucchini. And if you look, you can see what a trombone zucchini looks like. Aren't they cool? They are really delicious. They taste like artichoke hearts, and I think that is wonderful. In this next bed, in the middle and on the right, are 2 sun gold cherry tomato plants, and that is absolutely my favorite cherry tomato variety. Now the plant in the middle is an ungrafted sun gold, and the one on the right is a grafted sun gold. Now I have pruned them back a little bit, but both of them have been equally productive, so just like with the Chef's Choice orange, it really hasn't made a difference having that grafted tomato. At the end of this bed is my famous, or maybe infamous, Cucamelon rocket, and I'm growing 2 types of cucumbers on here. One is a cucumber from Burpee called Lunchbox, and I am crazy about this one. I'm definitely growing it again next year. You can see it's quite productive. They are very tasty. They're crunchy and they have a nice flavor. So it is working its way up my obelisk. Now the other plant, and it's very hard for you to see because Cucamelons are very petite, but it is growing up here too, but it wants to grow into everywhere instead of going up my obelisk. And I have not picked a single Cucamelon yet. They got off to a tough start because the birds kept pecking at them, and so I finally got them going, and maybe for all I know in this tangled mess there are some Cucamelons in here. But I do want to try growing them next year because if I can get them off to a better start, I think I will have more productivity. The next bed is empty. That's where our garlic grew. And so it is idle for the time being, and I'm hoping to start a cover crop on there in a few days. And that will give some extra nutrients to the soil. The next 2 beds I am especially proud of. They're my melon beds. The one you're looking at right now has Tuscan Napoli in it, and that's a seed I got from Renee's garden seeds. And then in the next row over on the right, you can see our honeydew melon, which is called Ha Ogan. And they are fabulous. That is a new variety we're growing this year, and the seeds came from botanical interests. Now let me give you a couple tips on knowing when to harvest melons. Knowing when to harvest melons so that they're at their peak of flavor can seem like a mystery, but there's 3 things you're looking for. Now, first of all, notice these 2 melons hanging side by side from the vines. The one on the left is quite green and obviously not ripe. The one on the right has turned a lovely peachy yellow, and that is a great indicator of ripeness. The other thing, which is maybe a little bit difficult to see, but you'll notice that there are some yellow jackets and wasps hovering around the melons. They can smell that sweetness of the flesh. And even though I'm not crazy about this as an indicator, it's telling you that that melon is ripe. The third thing you can look at is where the stem of the vine attaches to the melon. And when the melon pulls away from it, you'll see like a little air gap between the attachment and the melon, and that means it's ripe. Now obviously this melon is green, and so it's not ripe, but you can see the stem really well, so that's why I'm showing you this one. So this guy's got a little ways to go. The next bed still has some torpedo red onions growing in them, and those have been wonderful. We will definitely grow that variety again. The seeds came from Ed Hume seeds. And then we have just a few leftover copra onions that we've been using for dinners and such, and they are a wonderful long-keeping onion. We have already been harvesting our sweetness bicolor corn, and it is absolutely delicious. So it's another variety that we're going to grow next year. This is another mixed planting bed that I have in the garden, and what you're seeing initially is this mortgage lifter tomato plant, and I'll zoom in on the tomatoes so you can see how pretty they are. Now there is a story behind this plant that I think you'll find both amusing and interesting, because there is a lesson that we can all learn from it. So this very good friend of ours, Jay, decided he wanted to grow a mortgage lifter plant for me because I'd never grown the variety before, and he is absolutely sold on it. So he grew this lovely plant for me, and the day before he planned to give it to me, a windstorm came up, knocked it over, and decapitated the poor thing. I mean, isn't that just the way? Well, of course, he was horrified and embarrassed. He said, I shouldn't even give you this poor little plant because there's hardly anything to it. But I said, you know, I'm sure it will grow. Just go ahead and give it to me, and I'm going to put it in the garden, and we'll see how it does. Well, you can see it's doing beautifully. Now, in the meantime, I did a little research, and it turns out that you can take the decapitated part of a plant, stick it in a jar of water, and then let it root. It will root in just a few days, according to what I read, and then you can plant it, and it will grow beautifully in your garden. So, see, there wouldn't be any waste after all. Now, behind the plant, I have a few extra peppers growing, and they're doing great. And then I also have some white zinnias that are just gorgeous. You know, sometimes white flowers are underrated, but they're just beautiful. And then on the end, I have yet another obelisk. And this is where I'm growing my Malabar spinach. Now, I had never grown it before. I discovered that the birds think it is absolutely delicious. So it has gotten off to a very tough start, just like the Cucamelons did. So here they are. The leaves are absolutely gorgeous, and I think I'm going to have to put some kind of barrier around them to keep the birds from eating them, because I would really like to know what they taste like. The last two beds in this row are where I'm growing my pole beans on an arbor, and they have done really well. Now you can see a few yellow leaves up at the top, and that just happens this time of year. We had a very hot summer, as I mentioned earlier, so that is going to happen. But otherwise, it's producing beans well. The variety is Musica, and I got the seeds from Renee's Garden Seeds. Now, another thing I wanted to mention is that I am leaving a few pods on the vines, and I'm going to let them mature so that I can save the seeds from the beans. And if you've never done this before, it is so simple. You just let them get papery dry, just brittle, and you'll hear the seeds kind of rattling around inside. And so once that has happened and it's totally dry, you can pull them off the vines and put them into, like a jar or something, and let them store in a cool, dark place, and you can use them for next year. Also in the south-facing bean bed, I'm growing a couple of types of basil. We love growing basil so that we can make lots and lots of pesto. Now the plants are not doing as well as I usually can expect, and I think that's because this bed does not get quite as much sunlight as the rest of the beds in the garden, and so obviously I'm not going to plant them in that bed again. In the north-facing bean bed, I'm growing celery. It is Tango, and it is my favorite variety. Very easy to grow. In this bed, I'm growing some different types of winter squash and pumpkins. For the winter squash, I'm growing cushaw, butternut, and delicata. And then I'm also growing sugar pumpkins to make pies with, and this goofy-looking one called Red Warty thing. So this pumpkin doesn't have any warts yet, but I have high hopes. Here's my tomato bed. You can see that it's growing well and that I have been going through my pruning routine in order to get as many ripe tomatoes by the end of the season as possible. We have harvested a ton of tomatoes already, mostly to make tomato sauce and salsa. So they're doing really great. And pretty soon I'll have another video on the third step for terrorizing your tomatoes so that you can get a great harvest. This last bed is our other corn bed, and we're growing sweetness bicolor just like in the other beds. You might recall that we planted them a couple of weeks apart in the hopes of extending the season so that we wouldn't have all of them to harvest at the same time. That has kind of worked, but I think maybe we needed more of a span of time between the first planting and the second planting. If you are new to growing corn and you're wondering when to harvest the ears, there are a few things to take into consideration. One is you can feel the end of the ear and it should feel rounded out rather than pointy. That means that the kernels have filled out in this ear. Another thing you can do is look at these silks coming out of the end of the ear, which are these little filaments. They should be papery dry, almost like really dry hair. And the other thing you can do if you are really desperate is you can carefully peel back the ends of a couple of the leaves that surround the ear and look at some kernels to see if they look completely filled out and developed. Alrighty, that concludes the September vegetable garden tour. As always, I hope that your garden is growing really great. And if you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to drop me a line at susan@susansinthegarden.com. And no, I didn't pay that hummingbird to just come in the frame.